B'timra tá sibh a chuirde. Sin bhhailtain seo a chur forainn fáilte romh Hague an cid seo de Clark Avery RSí Canja. Ní féidir len sibh seo thuairt isteach Hague RSí Canja, mar sin tá mo déine a chur Clark Avery RSí Canja thugamh ar na man socialta. How are you folks? Shana Walsh here, manager of RSC Canja, and I am introducing this particular section of the winter programme. I hope you enjoy it. We can't bring you in here to enjoy the winter programme, so we are bringing the winter programme to you on social media.
Hello everybody, Philip Orr here, and myself and Joe Austin over many years have done a project called The Poppy and the Lily. And what we normally do is we travel to any venue that's willing to have us. We've been in everything from orange halls to venues with a strongly Republican audience. And we've talked about the importance of commemoration and how to think best about how to commemorate. And that centers very readily on the two flowers that we do talk about. Joe talks, and he'll talk shortly about the Easter lily, and I'll talk about the poppy. So I think a lot of what I try to do with regard to the poppy is to indicate just that the poppy is a very various flower. It's found all over the world in many different shapes and forms and variations, and has done all down through history. And people, for example, are often surprised to know that the ancient Egyptians had the opium poppy, and doctors in ancient Egypt would give the seeds of the opium poppy as a cure for pain or distress, because of course it's an opiate. And at a more sinister level, we know about the opium fields today, where drugs find their origins, and the roots of the drug trade there, and we know too down through history about the opium wars in China. So the poppy, there are many types of poppy, and the one that we tend to, those of us who wear it tend to remember, is the corn poppy, which you will find in the fields of Ireland, because if you say go through a part of a new motorway or a new road where the soil is dug up, you'll very often see poppy flowers at the side of the road. Poppies where there's dug up earth, seeds that have been there for generations will suddenly flower. So you won't be surprised that when it comes to the First World War, where with all that horrendous damage to the soil of the Flanders and northern France, that poppy flowers started to grow in among the trenches, and indeed in among the crosses that were placed. Very simple little crosses were placed there on the graves of men, very often very young men, who were the ancestors of people like Joe and myself, and probably many of you actually who are listening to this broadcast and watching it. So it's no surprise then that the poppy came to symbolize something really important. When you think about it, the red of the poppy represents the blood that was shed. The black represents death. It always does. You know, we dress in black when there's a funeral. And it was really, this symbolism was added to by a very powerful little poem that was written back in 1915. May 1915, the Canadian Army are there on the Western Front at the Second Battle of Ypres. And a doctor whose name was McCrae, John McCrae, found one of his best friends had been killed in a German attack. And obviously distressed by it, he penned a poem called In Flanders Fields. Now, I won't read all of it, but I'll read you a little bit of it, just to give you a flavour of this poem, which really brought the poppy into a more worldwide kind of gaze. He wrote, "In Flanders Fields the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row that mark our place. and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amidst the guns below. Well, as you can see, it's referring there to the poppy as being like something that the poet wanted to remember as being something that would bring to mind the death of his friend. By the way, I don't know whether you know, but in areas like Shankill and Woodvale or across the city in East Belfast, they have what they call row-on-row festivals. Now, festivals may be a bad word for it because you think of joy with a festival. But row-on-row is a quotation from that poem, I hope you'll remember. And they would lay out in East Belfast, say, little crosses still today on Armistice Day with the poppy on the cross. And so that's a quotation from the poem. It's not a pacifist poem. It's a poem from the earlier days of the war, long before the disillusion started to really creep into the way poets thought about the war. And so the poem was inspirational. It was inspirational in Canada. It still is. John McCrae died by the end of the war from pneumonia. And if you go to Ottawa today in Canada, you will find a museum to John McCrae. You will find that he's mentioned, and you'll find that the poem is highly regarded. Some authors have said that it was the most well-known poem in the Western world at the end of the First World War. So that poem really brought the poppy into view. Now, what's interesting after that, and again, Joe and I talk a lot about the role of women in our various commemoration practices. It really came down to two women, one American and one French, to move the poppy on to where it was something you read about in a poem, to where it was something you would wear. Now, the first woman that we refer to here is Moyna Mikhail, or I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but I would call her Moyna Mikhail. And she was an American lady, and she was connected with the American Legion, which looked after the needs of former American soldiers in the First War. And we kind of forget that tens of thousands of American soldiers perished in that war, as well as the ones we know about on D-Day in the Second War. She wore one of these poppies all year round in her breast, deeply touched by what she saw of all the shattered limbs of these soldiers. And their needs and the needs of their families. But eventually she started with her friends to circulate little poppies made of kind of paper. And that was beginning to give the poppy some significance in America. But over from France came a lady called Madame Guérin. Now, Madame Guérin was very taken when she came across to the American Legion and saw these little poppies and decided she would bring this to France. Now, as you well know, I'm sure, the French had lost on a titanic scale during that war. You think of battles like Verdun, and there were a lot of orphaned children, and in an era when the welfare state across the Western world was still only a gleam in the eye of some idealists. So she was very keen whenever the British decided in London to hold an Armistice Day service of considerable size in London in 1921 to bring poppy sellers over. And it caught the imagination of Earl Hague, who'd been the big general on the British side towards the end of the war. And he decided to set up a fund and to set up and give the possibility of poppy sellers to move around the streets of London at the end of that memorial event in 1921. Something like 9 million poppies were ordered and sold that year. It took off profoundly. And that really was the beginning of the Earl Hague Poppy Fund. Initially in Scotland, the poppies were made by ex-soldiers in Edinburgh, but then in Richmond and London, there were poppies made and sold from there. And that takes us right through in a way to where the Royal British Legion took on the story of the poppy and used it as a commemorative flower in the decades right the way through from the 1920s to nowadays. Um, I do want to say at this stage, that it's pretty obvious that the poppy is a divisive flower in many ways inside the Irish and the Northern Irish context. And anybody who knows the place we've lived in and grown up in, that is the case. And I do want to touch on that a little bit. But I do want to stress that that the poppy in itself, of course, is several things. I think if you look at the Royal British Legion site today, you will see that three things are mentioned. One of them is a symbol of remembrance. Remembering those like our ancestors who, for various reasons, would have gone to the war and died in 1914 to 18, or indeed have joined the British Armed Forces since. I mean, it's a symbol of remembrance for British those who joined the British Armed Forces. Now, that has to be said very clearly. I mean, there are ways of remembering those who died all across the world in various conflicts. I myself was involved at one stage in remembering Hiroshima Day, those who died, the Japanese millions, well, certainly hundreds of thousands, who either died or who lost their health to radiation sickness in that terrible event. But the poppy has, number one, it is a remembrance for those who died in British Army, Naval, or Air Force uniform, or their families who suffered. Number two, it can be a hope for a peaceful future. The wish to see a world freed of military conflict. That's an idealistic wish, but that would be the wish. And the third thing is to help out the armed forces community today. Those who are in many respects suffering from psychological ailments, those who have been bereaved, those who are physically handicapped, and so on. Now, any one of those can be your reason for wearing the poppy. Any one of them, but the Legion website does stress that you are free to wear or not to wear that poppy. And you're free to wear it in all different kinds of ways. For example, they have stressed in the British Legion that they do not object to people wearing the white poppy alongside the red or instead of the red poppy. It is up to free choice. And a decision could be made that you only choose maybe one of those three things, whereby the poppy might mean something to you when you put it in your lapel on the 11th of November or around that time. So, I just wanted to stress that, I mean, flowers are used for remembrance to do with military forces all around the world. The Irish Defence Forces have the fuchsia. The French have a corn flower. Sometimes the Australian soldiers at Gallipoli had herbs that they would place in their uniform, which they found on the Gallipoli landscape. For Indians, for those whose family were involved in the Great War, 1 million Indians were involved in that, they have a flower called the marigold. So what about these different alternative poppies? Well, yes, the white poppy in 1920s and 30s very much came into vogue. And nowadays, up to 125,000 would be sold on the streets of Britain. It's controversial to some, but what the white poppy is saying, we don't want to see any war. We want to remember everybody. Among the famous people who would wear it nowadays, for example, would be Benjamin Zephaniah, the famous Black British poet. Michael Morpurgo, the children's author, would wear a white poppy alongside a red one. There's the purple poppy, which was founded in 2006 and remembers something that should be dear to all of us in Ireland, where so many horses went from Ireland and died at the front. Over 8 million horses died in the First World War, and the purple poppy, or the little purple paw badge that you can buy, remembers those who died in the war. And it's not an alternative to the poppy, but it might be, if you wanted to remember those animals rather than to embrace the other red poppy, more familiar. So I'm trying to give a sense really of the diverse ways that this flower of remembrance, or any flower of remembrance, can be used. Why would I wear that poppy? It's something I want to talk about just when I conclude in a few minutes' time. But I want to say that in Ireland, yes, there's a strongly controversial element. I think many of the, for example, a harsh story, but many of the auxiliaries who arrived over in 1920-21 during the War of Independence would have been ex-soldiers, officers who'd taken part in the war. They felt very strongly about remembrance in those early days. And in that era, whenever there was you know, a huge conflict and all kinds of misdemeanors undertaken by the auxiliaries, the black and tans, evil behavior that only exacerbated the whole situation. The notion that of them wearing a poppy in their breast, or at least remembering the Great War through bells ringing in churches and so on, would have been abhorrent. And I think that sets the tone then for what happens in the 1930s, when you have the League Against Imperialism suggesting that wearing a poppy in the south of Ireland, in the Irish Free State as it was then, was regarded as a betrayal of Irish freedom from empire. De Valera, though, was very interesting. In the 1930s, he decides that it's important to do something about what is potentially a conflict. And it is potentially a conflict because there were poppy wars sometimes in the heart of Dublin around about Remembrance Day in November, when some of the young students at Trinity, very often from Protestant background, would wear a poppy, and they would be plucked from their breast by young fellows who were obviously avid Republicans, and as in turn, sometimes little razor blades were worn behind the poppies, so that young men would get a cut or a wound as they tried to pluck the poppies away. So De Valera decides that yes, the poppy can still be a legitimate symbol, but it should be sold under strict conditions, and it shouldn't be part of military displays as he would have seen them on Remembrance Day. So it really set the tone for, I think, what later became a lot worse when the Troubles broke out in '69, a sense of identification of the poppy with the British Army in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And indeed in the north of Ireland, of course, right from the early days of Northern Ireland, the Battle of the Somme and the Ulster Division were seen as emblems associated with the poppy, with the wearing of the flower of the poppy, with the Union Jack being flown, and with a sense of British identity. What has to be said is, alongside that you would have seen, I think, many soldiers from soldiers' families from nationalist backgrounds quite quietly trying to remember that war in which their ancestors died. I can speak of one particular person whom I know of, who went down secretly on his mother's behest from West Belfast, bought a poppy secretly and placed it at the cenotaph in the heart of Belfast near the city hall, because she wanted to remember two boys who had died in the war, but felt that it would be outside the mood and the political allegiances of her part of Belfast in order to do so. So concluding, I'd just like to say that for me, wearing the poppy, it's partly about how to wear it. I don't wear it as something to stick in other people's faces. I don't wear it for an extended period. I wore it for 2 or 3 days. I'd like to wear a little poppy metal badge that has a remembrance written into it of all those Irish soldiers who died from all across the 26 counties of Ireland. But I'd like to wear it in memory of two people. One is my great uncle, who would have died towards the end of the First World War as a prisoner of war. I see him as in many ways a victim of the war. I see him as a young fellow who had no idea what he was letting himself in for. And I know that I tend to think that if he were around today, he would find me wearing the poppy something that he would be pleased about. and that if I were not to wear it, that there would be a sense in which I would be letting down that memory. By the way, can I just add in that there is no obligation, I think, on anyone who wears the poppy, as I've said, to remember absolutely everything that is sometimes invoked. Now, what I mean by that is, it doesn't mean that I support British military activities in every sphere of the world. Some may do, some do, but I don't. And I do know some people, acquaintances of mine, who have been in the armed forces in Afghanistan and have thought to themselves that that war was not a war that I was happy fighting. So, you know, I'm not saying something here that could land me as some kind of traitor to the British Armed Forces by saying what I'm saying. But I'm indicating that, you know, it does not mean when I wear a poppy that I'm somehow lapping up everything that the British Army did abroad or that the British Army did in Northern Ireland. It's not the case. For me, it's about remembering those who have served. And I've worked quite a bit with those who came from security force backgrounds during the Troubles. I've worked with them. I've done various activities. Oral history, creative writing classes, and so on. And indeed, I do think that many of them, just as Republicans find solace and commemoration in the Easter lily, they find the poppy something which they themselves can wear at November time to remember the fact that many of them who came through that period have been greatly distressed by that. And many of them have memories also of other colleagues who aren't with us today because they died in that conflict and in that period of troubles. The other person that I want to mention in finally and signing off from this before we hear from Joe is my uncle who died in the Second World War. Who fought in the Second World War. He lived on till his 80s. And what my Uncle Ted did was to join up as a young fellow from a working class English background. He became involved in the Royal Engineers. He trained in the kind of technology needed to find the mines that were buried in the strands and the sands of Sicily, where the troops from Britain first made an attack and an assault on Fortress Europe, Hitler's Fortress Europe. And his best friend died on that beach. A friend who he had been the best man for his wedding a few weeks before. The two of them had gone ashore, as did others of their colleagues, without any weapons. Their job was to search for mines and make it clear for the infantrymen who were coming off the landing craft. Later in his war, and by the way, he was awarded a military medal for what he had done. Later in that war, he was part of, as the war came to an end and the few months of peace came along after it, he was involved in dismantling some of the Nazi architecture and the Nazi memorials, including the famous Horst Wessel stone. You may know that Horst Wessel was a Nazi brown shirt hero, and the brown shirts were commemorated in a song called the Horst Wessel song that every child in the Nazi youth movement, i.e. just about every child in Germany, learned off by heart. He destroyed that. He and his colleagues blew it up. And for me, that's a very good reason to remember him. You may be asking, why should I remember it? Why should I remember it with a poppy? Is it enough just to remember it without any kind of emblem? Well, what I will say about my Uncle Ted is right to the end of his life, he never had much time for the big 11th of November ceremonies. He didn't turn them on the television, and he didn't attend. It brought back too many memories for him. But I do think that that I do want to wear a poppy for him, and for men like him, because I know that my generation has not had to fight that kind of total war against fascism. There are worrying signs in the world today that it's on the rise again, that authoritarian leaders are on the rise, and it's a worrying sign. So I think all the more reason to remember Ted, and in my case, to remember him with a flower that I think stands very, very well indeed through the test of time for all those who in British Army uniform lost their lives, or at least contributed to winning a necessary war, or if not that, certainly at least fought as vulnerable young men in an army. It's not that one doesn't remember all those who died in war. Of course one does. I have been all too pleased in my day to have a close German friend with whom I visited the Western Front, and we remembered together. And it's my business to remember those who died on the other side of a conflict, as well as those who died in that British Army uniform that both my uncle and my great uncle wore. I hope that's given you some of my thoughts. I'm sure you will disagree or agree with some of what I've said. Normally we would discuss this in some depth with you, but that will be something maybe you'll want to do yourselves wherever you are watching and listening to this event. I think I'll pass over to Joe now. I think I've done my share, and I look forward, as always, over the past years, to hearing you speak, Joe.
Thank you, Philip. And while you were speaking, I was just trying to calculate the number of years that we have done this road show together, and it's 11 years. And as you point out, we have been in Orange Halls, we have been in Republican clubs, we've been in community centres, we've been right across the board. Anywhere that we're invited, we will go. And I always hear you saying that the most important part of our discussion is the engagement. Now, unfortunately, that isn't possible today. But perhaps those that tune in, who watch this interview, those who come from a community group or from any sector, can make contact with us. And when the real world comes back, we'd be only too happy to go to wherever they are and involve ourselves in the conversation. So I suppose, to set the scene for our discussions, and then I'll talk about the lily, I have to say that we have noted on occasions people almost shock and horror at someone either defending the lily or defending the poppy. And we begin our conversations by passing around and letting people look at what these symbols, which sometimes they have never actually touched, actually look like and feel like. So this is a lily. This is an Easter lily. This is a poppy. And it's one of the poppies that you made reference to earlier on, accompanied by the cross, although all poppies are not accompanied by the cross. And like all things symbolic, over the years they have developed into ceramic poppies and metal poppies, metal lilies. We have seen, as you keep pointing out, the celebrity diamond-studded poppies that people tend to wear. And of course, last but of course not least, we have the white poppy that you made reference to. And of course, there are other poppies that reflect the animals that died. So quite often when you approach this discussion, what you find is preconceived ideas, that symbols somehow are bad. Well, of course, that's not true. And if we look at our trousers, our jeans, our tracksuits, our shoes, our watches, you can see they're all labeled by some kind of a symbol or other. So it isn't that symbols are bad or good for that matter. It's how they're used and what the purpose of them being used for. So for instance, Republicans and nationalists generally comment that the poppy is a political symbol. And that's part of their opposition to it. It's a political symbol. My own view is that the invention of the poppy was not necessarily as a overt political symbol. That the purpose of it, certainly the selling of it initially, was to raise funds for the much needed former servicemen and their families. I also believe that if that is the case with the poppy, that isn't to say that some people, as you point out yourself in your discussion, it isn't to say that some people went on and they politicized to suit their own political agenda of the poppy. That's not an unusual situation. That happens quite commonly. But if there is controversy or discussion around the initial purpose of the poppy, there is none whatever. It's beyond discussion about the Easter lily. The Easter lily was designed to be a political symbol. It's worn to support and to remember those who died in a very political cause, a very political struggle. And it comes from that. While there has been in the past a benevolent side to the Easter lily, and I'll come to that when I give you somewhat of its history. Certainly, initially, it was not designed to be anything other than a rallying symbol for Republicans. And again, if we put that into the context, if you look at the months between June and May of June 1922 and May 1923, you'll see the Civil War raging in Ireland, devastating. Whole families at war with each other, counties at war with each other. The Republican movement that a few years prior to it, and I'm talking about the run up to 1916, that was an embracing body that had room for all of those who had the broad desire for Irish freedom, from the arts to the feminist movement to the nationalist movement, the socialist groups, had came together in this very broad coalition of the desire for not only a political change, but political freedom in Ireland. And of course, that led to the 1916 Rising and led to the War of Independence. And here we have in 1926, here we have in 1926, we have the end of the Civil War. We have the scattering of Republican forces, the failure to defend the All-Ireland concept, and we have the settlement for partition, and we have the loss of human loss that occurred during the Civil War. And let me give you some sense of that. Republicans in that period, in those months, lost something in the region of 3,000 personnel, 3,000 men and women killed in that Civil War. The state forces, are what became known as the regulars, lost something in the region of 800. Republicanism was designated. It had been scattered to the winds. The leadership of the Republican movement was some in jail, some dead, some scattered across the sea to America. The state, north and south, the states, to, as they would have sought, to ultimately defeat republicanism, had introduced the most draconian of legislation. In the south, the emergency legislation made it either virtually impossible, but certainly very, very difficult to do even the basics of commemorate those men and women who had died, both in the War of Independence and also in the 1916 Rising. The only organization that had been affiliated to the 16 Rising and to the Civil War, and who had remained steadfast against partition, was the Commonwealth. Every other organization had fragmented, had split, had fractured, had turned on each other. So republicanism, politically, psychologically, numerically, was in a bad place. In a very dreary, miserable hotel in Dublin in February 2000, February 1926, the Republican executive, the Republican executive of Commonwealth met to decide their future, where they were going, how they could attract new membership, how they could re-engage with the masses in terms of articulating the views and the aspirations of those men and women 1916 and the Civil War. And it was against that background that an idea came from a woman called Molly Holland. Molly Holland, supported by Sheila Humphreys, reflected upon the possibility of doing a Flag Day at Glasnevin Cemetery that Easter, a few months later, for two reasons. One was to provide that symbolic symbol and also to raise funds. So a symbol of republicanism is still here, it's still relevant, it still has a view. And the other was to raise funds, much needed funds. And they discussed having had the idea passed by the Commonwealth executive. They discussed what it would take, what would represent this symbol. What could the symbol be? Well, it had to be either a flag of some sort or a flower. And eventually they came down to the idea of a flower. And the flower, again, a spring flower at that time of year, they talked about a variety of. They talked about a pansy, for instance, a spring pansy. But the idea wasn't broadly supported. Someone had mentioned a Japanese lily that bore by chance the national colours of Ireland. And that idea seemed to be settled. Now, obviously, in terms of the getting of the lily, it was decided that they would manufacture a paper lily, the size of a flower, that would retain those colours, and that hopefully would be a fundraiser plus a bit of a novelty at the Glasnevin commemoration of that Easter. They approached the local IRA to tell them of their plans. The IRA had indicated that they also had a plan for that Easter. They wanted to do a collection. The IRA, scattered, disorganized, impoverished, were also looking at some way of raising funds and raising their own profile. It was agreed that they would have a joint enterprise. And what would happen then was that IRA volunteers, as well as Common volunteers, would be there at the approach gates into the cemetery, and they would sell. And they initially commissioned an order of 5,000. They let it be known that this was going to be an event taking place at Easter. And by Easter, a couple of short months later, the order that they had to, and they kept renewing the order had reached 50,000 lilies. So there was an idea then. The idea became that there was a market for this that was relevant. It could be something to raise funds and raise the profile of Republicans. The day came, the sales went ahead, they were very successful. And I suppose it's worthwhile noting that despite the assurances by the IRA that it was a joint venture, the IRA went ahead with their own collection, and they kept or retained their part of the sales that were generated on that Easter Sunday. Interestingly enough, a number of books make reference to the Dublin IRA being unhappy and less than content with having to sell flowers. Immediately after the sales, it was clear that there was an appetite for this sense of identification. The Common on for a while produced these themselves. They had almost a cottage industry, and they sold them the length and breadth of it. It became, during the Second World War, very difficult, for instance, to purchase paper. So the lily of a flower became cut down in size to a badge, a lapel badge, which is, of course, is the same basic design as a lapel badge that is sold to this day. In 1934, when Fianna Fáil came to power, the lilies were widely worn by Republicans of every shade and politics. But when Fianna Fáil came to power in 1934, they were disturbed at the volume of its membership that were wearing these lilies that were in fact designed by their political opponents. And of course, by this stage, Cumann na had, like all sections of republicanism, had become the focus of the state and of state repression. Cumann na had engaged a number of smaller organizations, both in the distribution and in the production of the Easter lily. The Cumann na Gleaney were commissioned to sell them for a small commission, and they sold them again through the length and breadth of Ireland. And it has to be said that although they were illegal, insofar as that the Cumann na refused, because of their non-recognition of the state north and south, the Cumann na refused to hand in tax returns, for instance, and under the basis of breach of the taxation laws and the charitable stature laws, both north and south, lily sellers were regularly arrested. And I think the last person arrested, for instance, in Belfast for the sale of lilies was a man called Liam Mahal, and was arrested at Castle Street, Royal Avenue Junction. I think that was 1965. So the lily had grown. It had become symbolic. The symbol of it was, of course, to remember those who died, as I say, in the Easter Rising and in the War of Independence and in subsequent campaigns. Fianna Fáil, alarmed by its own members and its own supporters at Easter wearing the lily, brought into being in 1932 another alternative badge, which was called the Perpetual Flame. It was a symbol of a lady, a woman, carrying this torch of a flame, a bit like the Olympic flame. It didn't catch on. It didn't really replace the lily. And they replaced it shortly after with the Camilla lily, which again was a flame type badge, and it had the dates of various other raisins, historical raisins in Ireland. But the lily had firmly grown. It had taken over. And throughout the years, the lily has been really the symbol of that commemoration and remembrance. It has taken, a bit like the poppy, and it has taken on different shapes, not necessarily different sizes per se, but different shapes and different materials. In 1970, when the then Republican movement decided to split and to go its own way, I suppose the most famous of those different types of lilies emerged. So that you had members of those who later formed the Workers' Party wore a lily that stuck, that has adhesive on it, and it stuck to their lapels. Those who would have supported Sinn Féin and the Sinn Féin strategy wore a lily that was attached to the lapel with a pin. So the nickname in Belfast, for instance, of members of the Workers' Party being the Stickies arose from that type of lapel. I said earlier on that while we can talk in terms of the politics of both these symbols, I think it is fair just to take a step back into the 1920s and look at the creation of Ireland after partition and how parallel with it Ireland dealt, and you touched on it a wee bit yourself, how Ireland dealt with that huge numbers of Irishmen who had fought in the First World War. Of course, many of them came back to Ireland. Many of them had joined the ranks of the IRA. Not all, many of them had joined. Many of them also went into the formation of the new National Army. And so, for instance, the National Army's strength during that period of civil war was 55,000. Many of those were made up of former British soldiers. The IRA strength, on the other hand, was 15,000. At the end of the Civil War, one of the interesting factors is that many of those who had fought on the anti-treaty side and who were the subject of imprisonment or harassment or land seizures were impoverished. Some of the organizations that were charitable of its day had sided with the state. Many of those were church organizations. They sided with the state. And because the state firmly was of the view that these people, in order for the state to survive, had to be crushed, they refused any charitable help. Those who had served in the IRA and those who had served in the British Army, because of their British Army involvement, were supported by some of the charitable institutions that then went on to become the British Legions. And I'm thinking of the Sailors and Soldiers organization that benefited greatly from the sales of the poppy. And I just want to give you a figure here, if I can put my hand on it. And it's just to give you a kind of comparison between the financial benefits of the poppy and the lily. In the year 1926, as best it can be identified, the sales of Easter lilies in the south of Ireland, and mostly in and around the Dublin area, was something like £34. Considerable amount of money at that time. The sale of the poppies was the poppy at the same time and in the same area was 3,658. So you can see that, and it goes on. It goes on for a period, and then it kind of levels out. But you can see quite clearly from that stage that there was nearly a parallel universe that was happening, particularly in the south of Ireland. Of course, in the north of Ireland, under the emergency Special Powers Act, emergency legislation, the sales of lilies was banned, and it was banned up until certainly the mid-70s, but it was banned. So there's no comparative figure. But you can see that there was this kind of duplicity within the state, fresh enough to remember the Civil War and fresh enough to remember the First World War, and this kind of almost divided loyalties, as you mentioned earlier on. Families who had someone who'd served in the British Army during the First World War. And myself and you, we recently, well, relatively recently, spoken in Orange Hall in the south of Ireland. And people had explained during their conversation that they wore poppies only to go to service. They wore it when they entered the church. They took it off when they left the church. And they were frightened, up and singled out, and physically attacked. So you can see, I think the other commanding fact that we should acknowledge, and perhaps it's a coincidence, perhaps it's more than a coincidence, that both the poppy and the lily are flowers in their own right. So that being one coincidence, and also that both of these powerful symbols were promoted by women. And I think those two connections, I suspect that those two connections are connected. So I'm going to stop there, and if Philip and I want to engage, if there's anything that I have left out, no doubt Philip will remind me, and Philip never leaves anything out, so there's no point in me there's no need for me to remind him. So,
Joe, I think I do leave a few things out here and there. I'm interested in the personal stories, obviously, with regard to this. I mean, I could talk about different events that I've been at, where in Island Bridge, for example, down in the former, still the War Memorial Gardens for those who died in 2 world wars, and it's a beautiful spot in Dublin. And I have been, remarking on the fact that I've seen wreaths laid down, which have both the green, white, and orange of the Irish state, along with the poppy, and it feels like a really interesting piece of reconciliation for that to happen. Um, you would have one or two personal stories yourself, wouldn't you, about I suppose attempts you've made to kind of bridge some of those gaps. I remember one story you told about a fella that was on the Falls Road one day, and it was a particularly special day for him.
I mean, a lot of the stuff that we do, as you know, it isn't to convince anyone of anything, but it's simply that people have almost informed opposition. So they know, rather than they dismiss prior to investigation, they know. But let me, if I can indulge and tell you two stories. The first story is the Island Bridge story. Myself and you were speaking to a group of women who had came down, I think from around Ballymena. And they were there, and they were going to Kilmainham, they were going to Island Bridge, they were going to a variety of other spots in Dublin. And it was a fact-finding tour. So we did what we always do, and we'd given out the poppies and we'd given out the lilies. And 2 days later, I got a photograph sent to me by one of the women. Some of the women at the meeting, and these were unionist women predominantly, some of the women put on Easter lilies. And it was a kind of a saying that, we have a broadness to our view. But I got a photograph a few days later, and it was of a poppy wreath at Island Bridge, and tucked into it was one of the Easter lilies that I had given, and they had laid them. The second one is that I was asked to provide, at one stage, to provide some media training for a group of young Irish people from the east of the city. And they arrived into a well-known haunt of yours and mine called Culture. We had a room booked up the stairs. And I had met them, and we had begun to discuss what our agenda was for that day. And I asked, was there any questions? The young lad put his hand up. And he asked at 11 o'clock, could he go out? And prompted by that, his friend said, and I want to go as well. And I, very mindful that I wasn't a school teacher, said, listen, you're not back at school, you can do what you want to do. And the lad then asked me, was there a back alleyway to Culture? And I said, no, I don't know, but I had assumed that they wanted to smoke, and they wouldn't smoke in the building. And I said, look, just go out onto the front of the road and smoke if you want to smoke. And they said they didn't want to smoke. That day was the 11th of November. So on the 11th of November at 11 o'clock. And I was completely ignorant to what they were suggesting. And I said, well, what's important? What do you mean? And they explained that they wanted to go somewhere privately, put on their poppies and stand for a minute's silence. This was in the middle of the Falls Road, where Culture Land is located. So the three of us at 11 o'clock, the two boys, two young men and myself, went on to the Falls Road, and we stood for that minute's silence on the Falls Road. And no one took us under their notice, not for 1 second. Now, I use them as examples, and I use them all the time, and I'm sure you're fed up listening to them, but I use them because it's an indication that your hand isn't going to fall off if you hold a poppy, nor will your other hand fall off if you hold it. And that we are not unique, and you said that when you spoke, we are not unique in the act of remembrance. We are not unique in having a symbol that recalls those who have died. And the fact that people wear a poppy or a lily, in my view, in my opinion, and it's done in a respectful manner, should receive a respectful response.
Yeah, I think, no, I'm not tired of hearing that, because it's a very heartwarming story, Joe, and bears repeating, I think it leads me on to think that I think during this decade of political centenaries, and we have one or two still to go before that decade sort of peters out. But I think during that decade, we've all had opportunities to reach out and find out stuff that we didn't know before, or experience what we didn't before. For me, a big thing was obviously the Easter risings at the heart of the Easter Lily, Eastertide 1916 and that event. And when the commemorations happened in Dublin 2016, I was invited to come down and take part in 100 different talks that were done around the city to remember the 100 years. So I sat in, it's an educational establishment on the site of the former Jacob's Biscuit Factory, where an awful lot happened in that particular rising. And I did a talk, but what I did it about was the men from the north of Ireland who had been in the British Army and who'd perished in the Easter Rising. So, I found out about them. One of them lies in a grave in Dublin. Another is buried in Grey Abbey because he came from the Ards Peninsula, and incidentally buried not too far away from the Reverend James Porter, who in 1798 died as United Irish leader. So, talk about the complications and the fluidity of history is really interesting. But I felt very welcome to do that. I enjoyed doing the research, and it was an embracing of an understanding, though we may all have had very different sides and inherit different sides, and in many ways are proud of our sides. Nonetheless, it's possible to find new ways of living together. I think the other thing I want to mention too, obviously, as down through the years, we have gone out and about to different venues and done our talks together. And I like to think that models something. If you remember, we went to Omagh on one occasion, where the Rural Community Network had brought together a whole raft of kids from different backgrounds under quite a noisy spot. But we each used some slides to kind of make things maybe a little more visual for them. And not only that, the kids were sitting around tables working together in groups. And Omagh, of course, not an easy place with its more recent history. It's had a very tumultuous period over the last 20, 30 years. But it was a good place to go. It was a good thing to do. And I like to think you're talking about a young fella, that would have been in your care, if you like, on that day, the 11th of November. I think it's good with young people to work. I remember another occasion when we went to what was primarily young people in the 174 Trust. I think it was a lot of young people from in and around the New Lodge area, perhaps, or Newington, or whatever. And again, I was very aware that people felt that the poppy was something. A lot of the young people were perturbed by the poppy as a symbol. And what I tried to do was say, look, this represents no threat to you as far as I'm concerned. Perhaps when they see the poppy used in murals on the wall of an area they wouldn't go to, I can understand that then there's an immediate feeling of wariness there. But I think, like all the symbols in this life, they're used in so many different ways. I mean, none of us, I think, if we're going to a funeral of a friend of ours inside a Catholic chapel or a Protestant church with a cross on it, none of us are, we hope, are feeling complicit with what the conquistadors did in America, under the symbol of the cross. I think our job is to find what's pure and good inside the symbol that we have and what matters to us, but to kind of wear that with a mix of pride and understanding or awareness. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think we have never, and we're out of time, by the way, but we have never approached any of these discussions, and there have been lots. We've never approached any of these discussions trying to convince anyone to do anything other than investigate. And it is the investigation, I think, that lends it to the broadness of symbols, of what symbols could mean, should mean, how they came about, and more importantly, or perhaps as important, how a symbol in your care or in my care should be treated with respect in order that others can respect it as well. So
Yeah.
if you don't mind, I'm going to finish where I began. And just to say, on my behalf and on your own behalf, we want to thank those who have tuned in to listen or to watch this interview. And I'd also extend that invitation when we reach better times, and we will, or if we develop as the electronic communications develop, that we're only too happy to engage with community groups, with anyone who has an interest in discovering or developing their understanding of two of the most powerful symbols, certainly on the island of Ireland. So can I thank them? And I'll leave your thanks to yourself.
Yeah, thanks to everybody, yes, for tuning in and listening, and thanks to the Connolly Centre for setting up the opportunity to do this one more time. And thanks, Joe, for your continued companionship on this journey. And I didn't realize it was 11 years. That makes me feel even older now. I better get this white beard shaved off.